Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again with the British in India. A special welcome to those from different time zones and particularly to tonight's speaker, Ben Hopkins, who is joining us today from Washington, DC. Ben is Professor of History and International Relations and Director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. He's on sabbatical this year and currently working for the US Department of State. According to his Sigur Center bio note, he's also working on a concise history of Afghanistan for Cambridge University Press, as well as a manuscript about the war in Afghanistan. So we're lucky he's taken time out to talk to us today about his most recent book, Ruling the Savage Periphery. Although Ben is proudly American, and we've already talked about this the other day, Britain can proudly claim Ben as an academic export, just as the late Charles Allen wrote, here's page 2, of Kipling, India made him, charged his imagination. So can we claim of Ben, British India made him, charged his imagination. Looking for a graduate research topic, Ben writes in his first book, I was inexorably drawn to the northwest frontier of British India. No doubt the stories of intrigue and spies, best encapsulated by Kim, initially captured my attention. I had little intimation, however, that on the frontier, fact is stranger and indeed more interesting than fiction. And so Afghanistan became the focus of Ben's scholarship and Britain the crucible in which it was forged. For Ben's undergraduate studies were taken at the London School of Economics and his doctorate in history at the University of Cambridge. Appointments at the LSE, Cambridge and SOAS, and a constellation of grants and bursaries led to the publication of works on the Northwest Frontier and SWAT, appointments at George Washington University, and numerous publications, appearances, and public lectures. And finally, the publication of Ruling the Savage Periphery, Frontier Governance, and the Making of the Modern State. The format of tonight's lecture is that Ben will talk for around 50 minutes, followed by question and answer. Please key any questions you have at any point into the chat box, and I shall read them out to Ben after his talk. Ben, the rostrum is yours.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight and the invitation. It's with great pleasure that I'd like to bid everyone on the call a good evening for those of you in the UK, good afternoon if you're here in the US with me, and very early good morning to anybody on the other side of the world in Asia. As Valerie mentioned that I'm working for the State Department, I think this is the first time I actually have to say that the remarks to follow are my own and do not in any way reflect the views of the US government, which is appropriate given that I'm talking about my academic publication. So the brief I've been given for this evening's lecture is, as Valerie said, to speak to you, hopefully with enthusiasm and interest over the next 45 minutes or so. And what I'd like to do in that time before we get to hopefully a more interactive period of question and answer is I'd like to tell you a story about how the peripheries of the world both are created and come to be ruled in the latter half of the 19th century. And with that story told on a global canvas, I would then like to talk about the significance of that story and why, though temporarily located in the 19th century, it's a story that continues to resonate to the present day. And it's actually at the present day that I'll go ahead and begin my presentation. And I have a little bit of an interactive presentation here that will jump us around the world. So let's go ahead and begin. On the 2nd of April, 2015, militants affiliated with the Al-Shabaab terrorist group stormed the grounds of Garissa University in the northeastern province of Kenya, killing 147 people in the attack. 5 months earlier, in December 2014, gunmen associated with the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan took over the army public school in Peshawar in northwest Pakistan and executed 145 people, including over 130 children. That same year in April, adherents of Boko Haram abducted 276 schoolgirls from Chibok in Borno State in northeastern Nigeria. All three organizations involved in these attacks are self-described terrorist networks advocating violent jihad to establish an Islamic political order akin to the caliphate. Now, numerous commentators and analysts have linked these incidents together as part of the ongoing, and I think that's important for us to recognize, global war on terror. Obviously, all attentions at present are focused on the horrendous events in Ukraine that are unfolding before us, but let us not forget that there is a continuing war that's 20 years old now that is still got the involvement of the United States and allied governments around the world. Now, in that global war on terror, wherein violent jihadist groups are waging a campaign against the West. However, these attacks at Garissa University, Peshawar Army Public School, and in Chibok are linked by more, however, than the so-called war on terror. The geography of violence presented by them is neither accidental nor coincidental. Rather, it is connected by deep historical roots. All of these episodes happened on what were previously the frontiers of imperial systems, and today are the peripheries of the economic and political global order. It is the liminal or peripheral character of these spaces, and more importantly, the people inhabiting them, which has made them systematically vulnerable to the violence so gruesomely put on display. Kenya, Pakistan, and Nigeria were all important linkages in Britain's global empire, and the spaces subject to these recent atrocities were at the imperial limits. Indeed, it was the advent of that empire in the latter half of the 19th century which rendered these spaces frontiers. Here along these edges, Britain's empire and the successor states it gave rise to define themselves, not simply physically, but also conceptually. For the way the empire and its constituent colonial parts conceived of and wielded power along these frontiers had a profound effect on how they did so elsewhere. The inhabitants of these spaces were also at the limits, or rather beyond the limits of civilization with which empire justified itself. Rather than being transformed into colonial subjects, they were excluded from the colonial sphere as quote unquote independent tribesmen. As such, they were not subject to the Queen's law, but rather ruled by their own quote customs and traditions, arbitrated, of course, by the colonial state. These frontier dwellers lay outside the sovereign purview of the colonial state, though nonetheless remain trapped within the suzerain one of the global empire. What happened along the bounds of the British Empire was by no means confined to it. The practices of frontier rule, which the British imperial juggernaut authored, maintained, and replicated, was part of a global paradigm which took place with the rise of the modern state-based international order of the latter half of the 19th century. The imperial practices of the British were decidedly more imperial than British. Their administrative doppelgangers could be found in other contemporary European empires. Included with these must be the neo-European states, found mainly in the Americas, such as the United States and Argentina, which were at the same time constructing the foundations of their rule and authority along its ever-expanding limits. Though not formally empires, at least in their own self-estimations, the actions of these states were substantively imperial. In setting up their own systems of frontier rule, these neo-European, neo-imperial states evinced a decidedly colonial face, at least those subject to such systems. This talk, in the book upon which it's based, is thus about the way states developing in the late 19th century defined and governed their frontiers and the people inhabiting them. The processes of bordering were foundational to the state-centric order constructed at the time and have much to reveal about the world we now inhabit. The following remarks examine a series of episodes from around the globe in the late 19th and early 20th century, both within and without the British Empire, to analyze what I call a globally ubiquitous form of frontier governance, a frontier governmentality, as I call it, which erupted along the bounds of state authority. By looking at the replication of governing practices in geographically removed, though nonetheless similarly situated spaces, I intend to show that something profound was afoot at this juncture in history with lasting consequences for our world today. And with that, I'd like to move to the terrain I'm most familiar and prone to, and that is the British Indian frontier with what becomes Afghanistan in the late 19th century. As a specialist in Afghan history, and that more broadly of British India and imperialism in the South Asian subcontinent, I was always keenly interested in this nebulous frontier between the Afghan kingdom and the British Raj, which develops over the course of the late 19th century. Now, the form of frontier governance, what I call frontier governmentality, is really personified by two pillars over the course of the late 19th century. The first pillar, which I'd like to talk about, is a law which is originally authored along the northwest frontier of British India, and in fact remains in effect, at least substantively, in modern day Pakistan. This law is called the Frontier Crimes Regulation. First promulgated by the Raj in 1872 and then reissued in 1887 and again in 1901. The version on the books in Pakistan today is the 1901 version. The Frontier Crimes Regulation was seen as a particular solution to the problem of the Pathan or the Pashtun, which is a colonial name for the Afghans who inhabit the lands on the frontier between British India or modern day Pakistan and the Afghan state. Now, rather than applying and expanding the normal set of administrative practices and procedures which were widespread throughout colonial India and the post-colonial states of Pakistan and India, what we see being erected on the frontier of British India with the Afghan lands is a kind of reservation system. They're actually called the tribal agencies, with the first one established in 1878, the Khyber Agency, and it will be joined over the course of the next 50 years or so by 5 others for a total of 6, which then Pakistan inherits. And these lands are ruled over by this Frontier Crimes Regulation. The central thrust of the Frontier Crimes Regulation is to rule over the inhabitants of the tribal areas by their own quote unquote customs and traditions. However, the colonial state retains the ability and power to adjudicate which customs and traditions are authentic and which, in the eyes of the colonial state, are inauthentic. At the very start, I think it's really important to underline, while the British Imperial Raj saw this as a culturally conditioned response to the problem of the Pashtun, this is really about property. And we can see this with the origins of the Frontier Crimes Regulation, actually in the Hazara settlement rules of 1870. Now, in the Punjab, in the immediate years following annexation in 1849, you had a very busy administrative apparatus that went about essentially documenting and understanding property systems of this key breadbasket of British India. And so you had a number of settlement reports that begin in the Punjab, but then are expanded to the rest of North India. And the Hazara region in northern Pakistan was subject to this in 1870. Now, what's really interesting in this Hazara settlement report is basically a fundamental misunderstanding or inability to understand systems of property ownership amongst the frontier Pashtuns. And instead, what the British decide is that ownership of land and just about everything that derives from that, including criminal law, is collective along the frontier. As a consequence, the real modus operandi or central thrust of the frontier crimes regulation is to treat the inhabitants of the frontier not as individual subjects, but as a collective. So inbuilt to this regulation is collective responsibility and punishment, a rule by substantive custom and tradition, which is overseen by the colonial state, but through quote unquote traditional mechanisms of justice, something called a council of elders or a jirga. There's a noted focus on blood feuds and preventive detention because these tribesmen are unfit for civilized behavior. So we stop them before they start killing each other because of blood feuds. However, while most of this administrative architecture actually seeks to exclude the frontier inhabitants from the main bodies of the colonial state, there is one significant exception, and I'm glad to go into it in Q&A, and that is adultery. And the reason for this is a pretty naked attempt, as it were, by the colonial state to emasculate frontier tribesmen, a group of men who the colonial state really hyper-masculinized in its own understanding of this space. Now, while the colonial authorities, to their own understanding in internal discussions, saw this, as I say, as a culturally conditioned response to the problem of the Pashtuns, what we see is when this kind of enters into the river of imperial administration, it very quickly finds other shores upon which it can take root. And so from the northwest frontier of British India, where it's first planted in 1872, it travels to other realms of British India, arriving in northeast India by the 1890s with the Chin Hill regulations of 1896 and the Kachin Hill tribes regulations of 1895. The Chin Hill regulations are actually still in force in Myanmar today. However, we can jump scale very quickly and much more interestingly outside the confines of British India to Britain's global empire. And here we actually have a story of imperial careering, both of individuals, but of a law itself. Sir Henry Dobbs actually cut his administrative teeth on the Afghan border in Baluchistan and was part of the administrative structure of the Baluchistan Agency. And it was there in the 1890s that he first encountered the frontier crimes regulation. Dobbs goes to the Basra Vilayat of the Ottoman Empire as part of the Indian Expeditionary Force of the First World War, and he's head of the Revenue Department, which is actually charged with the construction of a legal infrastructure in the lands conquered by the Indian Expeditionary Force. And so what Dobbs does is he essentially looks over the marshland shias of the southern Basra province, and he thinks to himself, I've seen these people before, and I saw them in the hills in Afghanistan. And so what he ends up doing is actually replicating the frontier crimes regulation in Iraq, first promulgating it in 1916 and then reissuing it in 1918. And it becomes one of the foundational laws of the mandate in Iraq and actually remains in effect until the Ba'athist coup in 1958. It's called the Tribal Civil and Criminal Disputes Regulation and continues as the key legal instrument for ruling over southern Iraq, as I say, until mid-century. Interestingly, after the first Gulf War, in which he's defeated, Saddam Hussein largely resurrects many of the substantive policies of the tribal criminal and civil disputes regulation in his governance of the southern lands until his own deposition, or when he's thrown out in 2003. Now, the story doesn't end in Iraq, but actually then travels to Mandatory Palestine. Again, the empire learns from itself, as it were. And as you can see here, there's an imperial replication of the frontier crimes regulation in Palestine via Iraq. Now, the collective punishment ordinance, which is passed in 1925, is, according to Palestinian mandatory authorities, something that they are simply copying from Iraq, with no understanding that the original provenance of this is on the Afghan frontier. So you can see this as it travels out of British India into the Middle East, in fact, into some of the most important mandatory spaces of the British Empire in the interwar period. And you can see here the direct quotation about its origins in Iraq, the focus on blood feuds. And its reference to other areas of empire where similar types of collective punishment ordinances, in particular Nigeria, which we'll get to in a minute, are in existence. Now, from Palestine, it travels into Transjordan. Again, an imperial career both of law, but of individuals, in particular with this person of Glub Pasha, and his so-called Desert Patrol. Now, while it isn't formally replicated in black letter law in Transjordan, it is substantively copied by Glub and his own administrators in Transjordan during the interwar and, in fact, post-war period up until the Hashemite kingdom gains its full independence. However, the use and replication of the frontier crimes regulation is not limited to the Middle East, but travels elsewhere in the British Empire, most importantly into the African colonies. So we see the replication of the collective punishment aspect of the frontier crimes regulation really put forward most famously by Lord Frederick Lugard, who's arguably the most famous British imperial administrator of colonial Africa. Of course, in 1922, he writes essentially the Manual of Colonial Rule, talking about our rule in the tropics. But interestingly, and again, you can see the mechanisms of imperial careering at work here. Where is Lugard exposed to the workings of the frontier crimes regulation? Actually, in his first posting as a young man. He was a subaltern in the 9th Norfolk Foot, which was posted to Peshawar during the Second Anglo-Afghan War, with him arriving in 1880. He actually caught, I believe, malaria, so he was not able to take part in the invasion and spent his convalescence around Peshawar. But it's at this very same time that he's spending in Peshawar that we have the frontier crimes regulation being applied to the frontier areas that are right in front of him for his 7 years during his Indian sojourn. So it's really interesting to see him replicate the ideas of governance that are first authored on the frontier of Afghanistan in places like northern Nigeria and the United Nigerian colony that he amalgamates in 1916. My favorite example of this kind of imperial career of the frontier crimes regulation is actually in Kenya, of all places. Here, interestingly, we don't have the personnel story of a Lugard traveling from the northwest frontier to the Somali borderlands, but we have the most direct replication of the frontier crimes regulation. It's actually first posed as the Special District Administrative Ordinance in 1932, which is ultimately enacted in 1934. This is one of my favorite stories from the research for this book because it, I think, speaks to the way that imperial bureaucracy worked. And that is when I found the file at Kew for the Special Districts Administrative Ordinance. They had the law written up, but the legal member of the Viceroy's Council, or the Governor's Council for Kenya, had actually included in a jacket in the back of the file the Frontier Crimes Regulation from 1901 from British India. And what he had done was he actually, in red ink, had simply crossed out British India and written British Kenya, and crossed out Pathan and Baluch, the peoples who had applied to in British India, and instead wrote Somalis. So this was, as it were, a carbon copy of the Frontier Crimes Regulation, transplanted in its totality to British Kenya in 1934, and remaining in effect until it's repealed in 1997. Now, though Kenya marks the kind of high point or apogee, as it were, of the formal replication of the Frontier Crimes Regulation, it is substantively, if not replicated, then shared in other parts of the empire, most notably in South Africa. And South Africa actually offers a really interesting case, because we do have the personnel link between the northwest frontier of British India and the South African colony in Sir Bartle Frere, who was the commissioner of the Cape Colony and governor of Natal during the disastrous Anglo-Zulu War. Now, prior to that, Frere had been the commissioner of Sindh, which at that point in time actually included the boundary between the Afghan kingdom and British India in what is today Baluchistan. So he had experience of governing the frontier peoples, and in many ways sought to build upon that experience in dealing with the indigenous peoples of Southern Africa. So on the one hand, we have a kind of personnel transmission, and we can chase the transmission, at least, of ideas of frontier rule in the person of Frere. But at the same time, an interesting and complicating part of the story with Southern Africa is that we have the kind of indigenous creation, as it were, of a similar system of frontier rule in the person of Theophilus Shepstone. Now, Shepstone built the entirety of his career in Natal and actually never assumes a governing post outside of Southern Africa. But Shepstone, in essence, is doing the same thing as the Frontier Crimes Regulation in dealing with the native peoples of Natal province and the Natal government at the time. So the focus on customs and tradition, the focus on collective punishment and collective governance, the focus on employing traditional forms of justice amongst these people. So it's a really interesting question here, because the story I've set up to this point is one of clear transmission from the Afghan frontier around Britain's global empire. But here we stumble upon something slightly different, where we have the same substantive system of governance being created at essentially the same time. Shepstone's Natal Native Code comes out in 1873, 1 year after the Frontier Crimes Regulation. So in similarly situated frontier spaces on the periphery of empire, essentially the same type of governance is being independently developed, which to my mind, while frustrating, because it would be very nice to tell a closed story of circulation, at the same time, it's also a much more interesting story, because these people are doing the same things in disparate locations, even though they don't necessarily recognize it and know it. Now, up to this point, I've really focused on the black letter law of the Frontier Crimes Regulation and how that is replicated either formally or substantively around the empire. But there's a second part of this story that I want to draw our attention to. And that part of the story is best personified by this man here. So Robert Sandeman, who's the founding agent of the Baluchistan Agency in the late 1870s. Now, Sandeman himself is responsible for the application of the Frontier Crimes Regulation along the southern boundary between Afghanistan and the British Indian Raj, where the frontier crimes regulation becomes part of the Baluchistan Code, but he also substantively expands upon the frontier crimes regulation. And he brings some really important elements to this type of frontier governance. Most importantly, he focuses on, in his famous quotation, the hearts and minds of the inhabitants of the frontier. And what he does most specifically is he recruits the tribesmen into policing themselves. And he does this by recruiting them and paying them for their service in a tribal militia that he then uses to police the unruly peoples of the frontier. Now, this reliance and integration of frontier tribesmen into the forces of violence of the colonial state is one that becomes broadly shared both within the British Empire, but also across global imperial spheres in the late 19th century. And I think that's an important one for us to remember. Up to this point, I have confined myself to the British Empire. And I think it's important for us to recognize that this type of frontier governance was not confined to the British Empire, and it did not necessarily exclusively originate within the British Empire. And the best example in my own research that I found of this was by moving to the United States. And I will say, as you can tell from my rather obnoxiously nasal American accent, that I grew up in the United States. And when I first encountered the tribal areas of the Northwest frontier, my initial thought was, these kind of look like Native American reservations that one who grows up in the United States just kind of imbibes through their own historical education. And when I returned to this research project in earnest, I decided to take that idea and put it under a rather critical microscope to see the extent to which indeed these two disparate places, separated by thousands of miles, were similar both in construction and conceptualization. And so I looked specifically at a reservation in the American Southwest in the state of Arizona called the San Carlos Reservation. It's, I think, the second or third largest reservation in the United States after the Navajo Reservation, which is also in Arizona. It's also the second poorest reservation in the United States after Pine Ridge in South Dakota. And I looked at how this reservation was governed when it was created in 1872. And what I found in that examination was basically all the elements that were present in the governance of the frontier tribal agencies of British India and around the British Empire are also present in the governance of San Carlos. So San Carlos has a particularly charismatic agent in its early years. The man in the middle of the upper photograph that you see there, a man named John Philip Clum, who actually becomes the subject of a terrible Audie Murphy movie from 1952 or 56, I can't quite remember, called Walk the Proud Land. And Clum in many ways is a character very much akin to Sandeman, who believes in winning the hearts and minds of the local tribesmen who are relocated to the San Carlos Agency. Now, the ways in which he governed over the San Carlos Agency, again, are very similar to those employed by Sandeman and more broadly by the British along the frontier of British India with regard to the tribal agencies. He focuses on a tribal police, where he recruits 15 of the leading headmen of the tribes that are relocated to San Carlos. He pays them a wage for that. He creates a tribal court, and that tribal court rules over the subjects of the San Carlos reservation through the customs and traditions of the inhabitants of the San Carlos reservation, of course, under the watchful eye of Clum himself. And there's another important element of both San Carlos, but more generally of the United States, which it shares with the experience of British India. whereas where the inhabitants of the tribal agencies in British India were not legally considered colonial subjects. They were referred to as independent tribesmen, nor were Native Americans actually considered American citizens until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. So they hold this kind of odd liminal space where they are within the ambit of action for the US government or for the British Raj, but they're outside any meaningful legal recourse to challenge that action. They can't take the colonial state or the American Republic to court. The last thing I'd say about the American experience in San Carlos, because you could knock me, as it were, for simply taking one of 300 reservations and telling that particular story, but the innovations in governance, which Clum authors, and you'll notice at the very same time that the Frontier Crimes Regulation is coming up, at the very same time Shepstone has created the Natal Native Code in South Africa. Clum is doing this at that same time in Arizona, and it becomes a template which the US Congress picks up and replicates on other Native American reservations around the country. So there's actually, within 5 years, a congressional law establishing Indian police forces, which actually have jurisdiction in these spaces up to the present day. Now, again, you could knock me for saying, well, you know, our American cousins, the British Empire, the Americans, culturally, linguistically aren't that far apart. So you're telling us a story about the Anglosphere, which is why I then jumped to my final case study that I examine in the book, and that is actually Argentina. Now, Argentina is a very interesting case study because Argentina, though historically, you know, part of the Spanish sphere of colonial history, by the late 19th century has essentially become very much entailed as part of the informal empire of Britain. The Argentine, as it was then called, you know, becomes a major recipient of British capital in the late 19th century, as well as a significant location for resettlement of different communities of British settlers, including a very large group of Welsh that have proud traditions in Chubut today. Now, Argentina offers another interesting case study because Argentina, at least in its origins, is very much a study in keeping with what I've been talking about around the British Empire and within the United States. At least their intention is such that as they go to undertake what they call the conquest of the desert between 1875 and 1885, again, note the dates, 1875 to 1885. So there's a very narrow 10-year period where a lot of this is going on. As they begin their conquest of the desert, as they call it, this expansion into the Pampas from the coastal areas around Buenos Aires, their intention, at least, is to replicate the American system of reservations. And in fact, when researching in Argentina, I found this copy of essentially the manual of administration from the US Department of the Interior that gave all kinds of details about the way in which the United States ruled over its Native American tribes in the reservations in the West. And this was actually integrated into Argentine law at the time of the conquest of the desert. But what's really interesting with the story of the conquest is that essentially the Argentine Republic was not strong enough to fully enact and carry out this vision of separation and sequestration of indigenous peoples onto remote territories and encapsulation within their own customs and traditions. Instead, because of the weakness of the Argentine state, we actually see quite a different path that's undertaken. In one way, a seemingly much more liberal path, and that is the integration, as it were, of indigenous peoples into the Argentine Republic as citizens. Now, while prima facie, that sounds like quite a progressive and liberal undertaking, what it turned to in practice was the erasure of the indigenous peoples of Argentina from public consciousness. Indeed, you can see some of the really interesting things about how this is played with this series of pictures I have here. In particular, the pictures of the Argentine coat of arms in the lower right-hand side of your screen, and of Casimiro Patagon above that, who was a native chieftain of a southern tribe. Now, you'll notice that Casimiro is actually wearing the Phrygian cap in this photo, which, as you can see, is also central to the coat of arms of the Republic of Argentina. And what's going on here, which is really fascinating in my mind, is that Casimiro Patagon, knowing this attempted expansion of the idea of citizenship to the indigenous peoples of Argentina, is actually visually claiming that. He's doing so by, holding himself up, as it were, as a member of the Republican Brotherhood, here complete with his woolen tunic. Of course, that's a British woolen tunic, because by this point in time, we have the expansion of British-financed wool trade in the Pampas, but his woolen tunic and his Phrygian cap. So he's actually kind of, staking out his claim to the Republican values, which are at least given lip service by the Argentine Republic. Now, in reality, what happens to Casimiro Patagon, he dies before the conquest of the desert, but his offspring and those of other indigenous peoples of the Pampas is that, as I say, they are both legally erased as separate from the Argentine body politic, but in large part they're also physically erased. They're actually put in concentration camps, and families are broken up, and women and children are largely hived off as servants to settler colonials across the Pampas. So the Argentine case, in a way, is an exception to the rule, because they don't fully integrate this frontier governance that we see on the British and the American frontiers. But the reason they are not able to execute it is because of the fundamental weakness of the Argentine state. They had intended to, but proved too weak to be able to implement it. Now, if that's my story, what's its relevance? What's the broader point that we can take from this seemingly disparate and discrete set of examples of rule along the periphery and along the frontier all around the world? And this is where I get to the theoretical part of my argument. But before I do that, I think it's also important to set that up by talking about the way in which colonial and national administrators thought about the peoples of the periphery and talked about the peoples of the periphery. So what unifies these people that are subjugated to this form of frontier governance across time and space? And the central theme that unifies them is a focus on and belief in their essential savagery. In all of these instances, the colonial powers as well as the national powers talk about these people as savages. I mean, perhaps most famous in the British instance is a speech that Gladstone gives during his Midlothian campaign, which brings him into office in 1880, called The Rights of the Savage. And he gives this speech decrying the excesses of Disraeli's government and imperialism, in which he basically says, do not the Zulus who face off against our guns in Zululand, or the Afghans of the northwest frontier, though savage they may be, have rights which we need to respect. Now, what is the fundamental marker of savagery, not only in political rhetoric, but in the minds of administrators? It's the lack of individual ownership of property. That in all of these instances, the people subject to this form of frontier governance lack a legitimacy over the land that they occupy in the eyes of the colonial and national powers, because they're not individual property owners. Indeed, this becomes perhaps most clear in the American case, where we have the Dawes Act passed in 1887, which President Theodore Roosevelt famously refers to as the something along the lines of the great hammer, which will smash up the collective ownership of Native Americans and turn them into modern civilized property owners. So it's this language and rhetoric of savagery, the foundation of which is the understanding of these people as not fully civilized and realized individuals because they're not property owners. With that said, then, as I say, what is the theoretical takeaway here? Well, I think the main argument that I make in the book is this, because I use this term frontier, and I've been talking about places on the edge of colonial or national authority. So there is, in our imagination, often when somebody talks about a frontier, a geographic imaginary that we need to address. And I want in this work to get away from that geographic imaginary. Why? Because first and foremost, we need to recognize that frontiers move over time. Now, whereas the British Indian frontier with Afghanistan, my own region of specialization and the origin of my study, is remarkably stable for the entirety of the British Raj, some of the other places I talk about in the work, most notably the United States, but also Argentina, the frontier is not marked by stasis, but is rather marked by movement. And so rather than thinking of a frontier as a place, geographical fixity, I want to think of frontier as a practice. That frontier is a space rather than place in which practices of authority are enacted. And this is where I get to my academic jargon, and I apologize in advance for it, but let me explain my use of this jargon, what I call frontier governmentality. Now, I've talked about this type of frontier governance, but I want to be a little bit more specific with this term frontier governmentality, because what I see a frontier as, a practice, is really, it's a set of 4 practices that when they appear together constitute a frontier. Now, these practices are common both within the colonial and national realms, either individually or in different combinations, but the unique combination of the 4 of them together, wherever you find that, you find a frontier. So what are the 4 elements of frontier governmentality? Well, first and foremost, indirect rule, the focus on ruling these people through their own customs and traditions, through their own forms of judicature. Secondly, what I will call sovereign pluralism, or what other scholars have referred to as layered or nested sovereignty or suzerainty. This is best exemplified within British India, where rather than an exclusive and unitary claim of authority that most international relations or scholars or political scientists associate with the modern state, the historical reality is a recognition of different layers of sovereignty. I mean, the British Raj does this most famously with the princely states, where we recognize a delegation of sovereignty, or rather a division of sovereignty amongst the princely states between British India and the Crown. But very much this idea of a pluralistic sovereign topography. We also see this in the United States, for instance, where, according to US law, even today, Native Americans have sovereignty and are recognized as, quote unquote, a domestic dependent nation, whatever that means. Third, what I term imperial objecthood. Now, I mentioned this briefly in my earlier remarks, and that is, in all of these cases, these people are considered in some form or another independent tribesmen. And this is more than just a political gesture. It's also a legally important and legally significant category, because by referring to and recognizing these people as legally independent, they lay as outsiders to the system. They are not colonial subjects, nor are they citizens of the Republic. And as such, they have no standing in front of a colonial court or in front of a domestic court. This actually is true in the United States, where it's not until 1881, I believe, with the Crow Dog case, that Native Americans are even recognized as legal persons. Before that, there's no recognition of them in court. Under the Frontier Crimes Regulation, as I mentioned, the people subject to it, the inhabitants of the frontier, the Baluch and the Pathan, they have no access to a colonial court. They're fundamentally denied that, and they're denied that on the basis of them being independent. Although there is a recognition of realpolitik here, that though we call them independent, and by doing so, deny them access to the colonial judiciary, they're in fact not really independent. And we have this most famously articulated in a parliamentary debate by Lord Salisbury in 1897, where he actually is on record saying essentially what I just said. Though we call them independent, we really don't treat them as such. And then the final element of frontier governmentality is economic dependence. I mentioned with specific regard to Robert Sandeman that one of the elements of his frontier governance was the recruitment of tribesmen into forces of violence in the form of frontier militia, or for John Clum on the Apache reservation, a reservation police. So we actually have not only a monetization of the tribesmen so that they will monitor each other. So you integrate these people into the colonial or into the national economy, but at such a low level of wage work that they necessarily become subservient to and dependent upon that larger surrounding economy. So you introduce a cash economy into the frontier and you make people dependent upon that cash economy. And that's actually why I use governmentality rather than governance, because this is more than simply doing what's been done before. Because definitely we can see resonances of this type of practice in previous empires. For India, we could see it. The Mughals used similar methods of rule along the frontier. The Sikh Empire did. The British themselves were very self-consciously constructing this off Tacitus's Germania, which frontier administrators had read, which of course is Tacitus's history of how the Roman Empire dealt with the German tribes. What's different, however, is the advent of global capitalism in the 19th century, which goes back to this issue of viewing the inhabitants of the frontier as savages because they're not individual property owners. And also the recognition by state entities through the course of the 19th century of the economic realm as a realm for regulation, as a realm of political economy, as it becomes known during that period. So by using governmentality, I hope to have a temporal marker here of really laying down the significance of that. So in conclusion, what are the legacies of this type of frontier governmentality that, as I started with, continue to erupt globally today? Well, number one, first and foremost, and I think most heartbreaking of this, is a history of violence and a continued history of violence. I began with the attack on Garissa University, the Peshawar Army Public School, and the kidnapping of the girls in Chibok. Sadly, since the publication of this book, I could actually expand that list. I would also note that that violence is both actual, as we see in those, or what academics like myself like to refer to as epistemic, violence that doesn't necessarily draw blood, but might come in the denial of rights. Good example of this is on the San Carlos Reservation, where recently tribal land has been forcibly taken from the reservation for the exploitation of the largest copper strike in the Western Hemisphere by Rio Tinto. The second element that I want to focus on for legacies is that while often, and especially today, we think that these places are somehow aberrational, or they're places of fragility, or even of state failure, far from it in my argument. These are actually parts of the design. These are intentional, they are constructed for specific purposes, and they're maintained for those purposes. So rather than thinking of the frontier between modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan, the FATA as it's called today, the federally administered tribal agencies, the American government in particular during the war in Afghanistan used to kind of view this as the Badlands. It was the troubled, ungovernable area. This is actually an area that was created to be such by the British and adopted by Pakistan to continue in that tradition up to the present day. As such, they are definitional to modern states rather than exceptional. Like I say, these are not spaces of ungovernability or outside of state control or aberrations to the norm of what state control should look like. These are foundational to the construction of modern states and the ways in which modern states express their power over peoples and peripheries where they can create frontiers through my frontier governmentality. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to engaging with you through question and answer.
Ben, thank you for that absolutely outstanding talk. Really very thoroughly enjoyable, absolutely smashing. Whether there were any American newspapermen who were serving along the frontier, because I think it was William Howard Russell, who was the American newspaperman who covered the mutiny. I think he was there hot on its heels. And he was correspondent for the Times, so I guess he was covering it for a British newspaper. But I know there were British newspapermen, Scots newspapermen, English newspapermen who marched with Earl Roberts from Kabul to Kandahar. Were there any Americans who were serving with the British forces as newspapermen who might have been able to take these ideas over to America and transfer them to people like Clum?
That's a wonderful question, Valerie. And to be perfectly honest, when I started on this, I expected to find some sort of link like that, a personnel link or some clear chain of transmission for knowledge, that if it wasn't a particular individual, that you would find that they're reading the same kind of thing. Indeed, Sandeman, for example, influences a very famous French general whose name I'm going to butcher and will apologize up front, Latouret, I believe, who was a key colonial officer that suppressed rebellions both in French Algeria and also Indochina. But Latouret actually talked about how he read Sandeman. So I wondered if you would see something similar with that the Americans would be reading or knowledgeable of what was going on in British India. Now, by no means would I claim to have the authority to categorically dismiss that, because I'm sure there are examples of that, and definitely from previous research, I know of Americans who actually served in the Raj's army. There's a great example in my first book. The first American to go to the Afghan kingdom was a Pennsylvania Quaker named Josiah Harlan from Philadelphia, who actually joined the Bengal artillery and deserted after the first Ava War because he didn't like the discipline. And so he went and he sold himself essentially as a mercenary to the court of Dost Muhammad Khan in the 1820s. So there are certainly interchanges like that. Did I find that in terms of informing the United States and its creation of this form of governance along its frontier? No. And in a way, I was initially a bit disappointed. At the same time, I also was fascinated by it because I thought this makes the story more interesting, because it's not then just about a unitary point of creation where this all, for as much as I would like to claim, has its origins along the Afghan frontier with British India. Rather, I think the larger point that we're seeing is there's a logic of statehood and a logic of state formation at work here that is so obvious to empire makers as well as nation builders that it's the solution they all hit upon. And in a way, I find that an even more fascinating story because it moves away from a story of personnel and personality and to a structural one. And if I could just round off by saying, you ask about the United States, where I did not find the personal connection. Where I did find the personal connection, which was fascinating, was actually Argentina. And in Argentina, what I found was a man named Ignacio Fotheringham, who was an ensign in the East India Company Navy. His father, who was Anglo-Catholic, had been the aide-de-camp to Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. And he did something, I couldn't tell what, but he did something very bad in Basra involving a mosque that gets him drummed out of the service. And he goes home in disgrace just after the mutiny in 1858. And he was contemplating immigration to Australia when a family friend introduced him to Juan de Rosas, who was the exiled Argentine dictator then living in Sussex. And Rosas said, don't go to Australia, that's kind of a waste, go to the Argentine. And so Fotheringham actually goes to Argentina, emigrates there in the late 1860s, and he becomes one of the key lieutenants in the conquest of the desert in the 1875 to 1885. He's one of the aide-de-camps to the then president of Argentina, and actually ends up retiring as a 3-star general and a regional governor in Argentina. But he writes this terrible, self-serving and really poorly written autobiography in Spanish, where he actually talks about his experience battling the Afghans on the frontier and how similar that was to killing the Mapuche on the Pampas. So there was the personal connection with Argentina, which I found absolutely fascinating.
Now, I've got quite a number of questions. The first is, and this came in fairly early when you were talking on the topic, would you agree that Sandeman's success in Baluchistan was due to the centralized structure of the Baluch tribes in contrast to the more segmented and militant Pathan tribes of the northwest frontier?
Yeah, this has long been one of the operative theories for the success of the Sandeman system. I think rather than going down that, I'd say we have to think about, what was the point of the Sandeman system, i.e., what do we mean by success? And what we really meant by success, or rather what Sandeman meant by success, is keeping this frontier quiet, right? Now, what's interesting is Sandeman and his system becomes the bedrock of modern counterinsurgency, even though modern counterinsurgents don't recognize that. And I actually traced this in some other work. And again, this goes to the chain of transmission. So bear with me for a second, but I'll give you the personal genealogy that will explain the intellectual genealogy. Sandeman's main aide was a man named Richard Isaac Bruce. And actually, Sandeman never wrote his own autobiography, but Bruce wrote a biography of Sandeman. Richard Isaac Bruce had a son, Charles Bruce, who actually serves on the frontier of Baluchistan in the 1930s. And he's the colonel of a regiment on that frontier. And his subaltern, or one of his subalterns, is a guy named Briggs, Harold Briggs, who becomes the author of the Briggs Plan, which is the foundation for the counterinsurgency in Malaya during the emergency in 1948. And of course, the Briggs Plan, or as it's erroneously thought of, Templar's idea, Richard Temple's idea, the Briggs Plan is closely examined by the United States in Vietnam in the 1960s. And the US military copies significant parts of the Briggs Plan and makes it part of its counterinsurgency in Vietnam, which of course doesn't work. When the United States, facing an insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, then rewrites the US Army manual as the counterinsurgency manual, then publishes it in 2008 by David Petraeus and a couple of other people. That experience in Vietnam is re-examined and reintegrated into combat doctrine for the United States. So even though they think they're learning from Vietnam, they're really learning from Sandeman, which actually gets back to your questioner's point about success, because when I wrote about this and then criticized it in the US context, I said, Sandeman was successful in what he set out to do, in the sense of simply keep this frontier quiet for governance of the British Indian Raj. That is not what the United States and its allies sought to do in constructing a democratic and resilient Afghanistan in 2021. There's a problematic ignorance of historical context in that transmission that I think really accounts for its failure later.
Now, different question. What is the relationship between the frontier governmentality being discussed and modern terrorism?
So, of course, I do the cheap party trick at the beginning of the book and the beginning of my talk, and I offer these kind of flashpoints in the modern world that are understood through the rubric of terrorism. And I think, at the foundation, there's two stories to tell. I'll tell the more general one first. And that is, at the foundation, violence can take root in a vacuum where state power and authority is absent or lacking. And that what we see in all of these spaces, northern Nigeria, the Somali-Kenyan borderlands, the Fatah, Pakistan, we can name other spaces around the world, but in all of these places, what's fundamentally lacking here, and recognized as such by, for instance, the US government with the new law it just passed, is the absence of state authority, whether that be because it's contested or because the state intentionally decides to step back and not be there, which then creates an opportunity for political instability in other actors, be they terrorists or local warlords or something like that. So I think that's the first point we need to recognize. The second point, I think, is best illustrated by looking specifically at the British Indian frontier with Afghanistan, or today's Afghan-Pakistan frontier. This becomes derisively the center of the insurgency against the Afghan government, so much so that the US government referred to it as AFPAC, right? Again, in separate research that I've done, it's really interesting. If you actually do a historical map, you find that about every 30 years, in almost exactly the same spot, some form of anti-state insurgency takes root, and inevitably along the Afghan-Pakistan frontier assumes a religious rhetoric to it. The kind of ground zero for this is the Swat Valley, where we had the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistani take over Swat famously in 2007, 2008, which launched Malala Yousafzai to international fame after she was shot, having stood up to the TTP. And that was very quickly understood to be part of the larger war on terror. Yet, if you historically map in this space, about every 30 years, there is this kind of anti-state insurgency in this space where people who've been systematically disenfranchised revolt against state authority. And I say systematically disenfranchised because, for instance, the people of the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, were not recognized as Pakistani citizens until 2001. And the FATA and the Frontier Crimes Regulation in substance remains, but was not legally abolished until 2018 with the 25th Amendment of the Pakistan Constitution. And so what you essentially have are you have these spaces where the state has decided to absent itself. And, in that absence, should we say, never do well people assert authority over that. And in today's realm, I think it does take that, assume that character of terrorism.
Next question is, many contemporary scholars working in your field equate concepts such as quote unquote savagery and quote unquote civilization not as marks of difference or their property status, but as fundamentally racist in its modern sense. You have not mentioned the concept of race at all. Do you think the wholesale recategorization of British imperial history as racist is valid or helpful?
Wow, the second part of that question just looks like a giant landmine. I think I will step to that side. But I do very much appreciate the question about race and how that plays on the frontier. Because of course, many of these people, not only on the British Indian frontier, but elsewhere, I mentioned how they become recruited by the colonial or national state into an economy of violence, either as a tribal militia or in British India, most famously as a martial race. In all of these places, the Apache, the Pashtun, there's actually a group along the Kenyan-Somali frontier whose name escapes me, but essentially they are in the colonial mythology lionized as, for lack of a better term, kind of manly men that make very good soldiers, right? And so they become central to recruitment efforts in colonial armies. So there is definitely, in an odd way, a kind of positive racial aspect ascribed to these people, because they're very much seen not only in racial but also in highly gendered terms, where masculinity becomes a mark of their race. And for the frontier Pathans, this is in contrast with the effeminization of the Bengalis that British civil authorities, especially in the late 19th century, are looking down upon, in part because the nascent Indian nationalist movement is really taking root and has its brain trust, as it were, amongst Bengali intellectuals. So I think it's really interesting that in all of these spaces, race does definitely come into the language, but it's also wrapped up in gender, and almost has a positive connotation vis-a-vis other subject peoples. Of course, these people, the frontier Pashtuns, the Apache, whoever, are never equal to whites, but they're better than the Bengalis, right? Or they're better than the Iroquois, as it were.
Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking talk. To what extent would you feel your definition of borderland people would compare with James Scott's, of people furthest from the seat of government having a very loose identity with the state?
So I slightly disagree with Scott, because Scott in his work kind of portrays what he calls Zomia, or the highlands of Southeast Asia, as a space free of state control. And so it's a space where these people can retreat from the reach of the state. And it might seem pedantic, my disagreement, but being free, I see it free of a certain form of state control. That it's not that these spaces then become, a kind of Hobbesian land of chaos where there is no order. Order is constituted, it's regulated and maintained by other social entities that maybe we today wouldn't recognize as a state. So for instance, either in his highland Zomia, or definitely in my area of the frontier with the Pashtuns, even though there is an absence of the state, that does not mean, number one, an absence of order. It does not mean an absence of governance. It doesn't mean an absence of taxation, right? What it means is an absence of a particular constellation of state-society relations. And so I don't agree with Scott that this becomes a kind of area of retreat. I'd also say that Scott, in characterizing that, is digging a very deep vein of imagination of the hills as this space of freedom, one that you see throughout the writings of colonial officials. So for instance, if I can just kind of finish quickly with this, in my first book, I talk about how British India encounters Afghanistan at the beginning of the 19th century. And the key player in that is the first British plenipotentiary who is dispatched to what was then called the Court of the Kingdom of Kabul. And he's this man named Mount Stuart Ulphinston. Ulphinston writes the most important book ever written about Afghanistan, even today. It's published in 1815. It's called An Account of the Kingdom of Kabul. And it's an encyclopedia of everything known and knowable about the Afghans. And how this relates to this Scottian argument is precisely this, that in the pages where he's talking about the Afghans, I mean, he has stuff about their marriage rights, about their flora, their fauna, their weddings, et cetera, et cetera. He's got this passage where he talks about them, the Afghans he sees, as like the Highland Scottish clans. And he actually refers to Hashan al-Hattak, who's the most important Pashtun language poet of the past half millennia, as the William Wallace of the Afghans. So he reifies this idea that because they're hill dwellers away from the centers of state authority, that they are more free than anybody else. And we see this repeated not only about the Afghans, but Sarmiento, who's the Argentine, he writes this book called Civilization and Barbary, and he talks about the hills in the same way. I will say, and this is one of the reasons that we find these places where they are, there's a basic return on investment strategy that imperial and national administrators are doing in these places. And that is they look to these places which are not necessarily agriculturally productive. And they think, how much is it going to cost us to expand our normal administration here? It costs X. How much are we going to get in return? We're going to get Y. Well, the costs are not commensurate with the return that we'll get. And therefore, rather than extending our centralized state presence here, why don't we instead come up with a different form of governance? And that tends to be these reservations or agencies.
Different question. How would you describe the legacies of this frontier governance in the contemporary Arab Gulf? And how did the discovery of oil, for instance, influence these dynamics?
Okay, so in the Gulf, I think the best example here is actually with Iraq, with the Basra Vilayat, where we have the tribal civil and criminal disputes regulation. And essentially that's eviscerated in the sense of in the period between the first and the second Gulf War, Saddam tries to use some of the elements by relying upon village headmen to enforce collective punishment and collective governance over the southern realms of a very truncated Iraq state. But eventually that gets obliterated for two reasons. One is the ecological damage done to the Basra Vilayat by the draining of the marshes by Saddam following the 1991 invasion. And the other is the extension of state authority. So, these places can exist when the state doesn't, and by the state, I mean the kind of centralized state entity of the modern day, doesn't insert itself. Again, to jump slightly, we can see this in Pakistan. Why does the Fatah exist in Pakistan, at least in law, up until 2008? Well, because the Pakistani state continued with that same kind of return on investment calculus initiated by the British Raj and looked at the Fatah, the federally administered tribal agencies, and said, going in, we're not going to make much money in terms of taxation. And we're actually going to run into people who probably look at us fairly hostilely, that are not going to be happy for us to be here. And so essentially, the establishment of a state is founded in violence, right? Because the state is all about a monopolization of legitimate forms of violence. And sometimes that has to be done violently. The Pakistani state does not enter the Fatah in any substantive way, really until 2010. And when it does enter, it enters in the form of the army that launches no less than 10 campaigns in the Fatah. And the reason it does it ostensibly at that point is because of the terrorist threat to Pakistan itself, but also there's a lot of economic advantage which the army actually gains from those campaigns in the Fatah post 2010.
Now, this will have to be our last question. I think you referred to the Pathans as Afghans living in British India. What does this imply for British attitudes to the Afghans living in Afghanistan? Constitutionally, they were not subject to the law governing the frontier areas, but presumably they were seen as similarly savage. Did the British at any time envisage extending the frontier law to Afghanistan proper when they invaded that country? In other words, treating Afghanistan as a whole as a frontier area.
Right, and that's a wonderful question. We should start with terms. I mean, Pathan is a name not only employed by the British Indian government and British authorities in India, but actually South Asians themselves referred to Afghans within what is today India and Pakistan as Pathans. And we have important diaspora communities of Pathans dotted throughout what was British India, dating back in time. So the most important arguably of this was the Rohilkhand kingdom in the Rohilla kingdom in Rohilkhand in modern day UP. And you know, I used Pathan, Pashtun. We could also use Pakhtun, which is the hard northern way of saying it, and Afghan. There's a separate story about the use of that nomenclature in Afghanistan, because there is a lively social debate about, and political debate, what constitutes an Afghan. Are Tajiks Afghans or only Pashtuns Afghan? I want to sidestep that here and go directly to the meat of that individual's question, which was, did the British ever consider really extending the frontier crimes regulation to Afghanistan itself? So a colleague of mine, Francesca Fioli, has written a wonderful work about how the British intended with the Second Anglo-Afghan War to domesticate, as it were, Afghanistan into its governmental structure. And her argument is that they kind of were looking at a princely state like the state of Halat as the example. I'm not sure I fully agree with Francesca's argument, though I think it's very, very well put. And I think it's one to seriously consider. I think ultimately, you know, whenever I teach, especially on the Anglo-Afghan wars, I always say it's always assumed that the British lost those wars. And tactically, they're marked by these incredible defeats, the retreat from Kabul for the first war, the Battle of Maiwand. But strategically, the British actually win those wars, in the sense that the British strategic calculus changes through the course of those wars. And they end those wars realizing that the best relationship they have with Afghanistan is the one that they had before they went in, which is at a distance and essentially in control, especially financially, of Afghanistan. I've seen nothing to indicate that the British ever thought of actually integrating Afghanistan as a kind of Fatah writ large. I mean, we have to acknowledge that from Kabul's perspective, the frontier areas on the Afghan side were equally problematic. Indeed, the Afghan monarchy has a name for that area. It's called Yagistan, or kind of land of chaos or disorder. And what we see is that over the course of British relations with Afghanistan, a number of Afghan rulers used the instability of the frontier as a kind of asymmetrical weapon against the British. So for instance, during the Third Anglo-Afghan War, the Afghan king Amanullah actually uses the frontier tribes as kind of a means of stirring up disorder to increase the cost of the war to the British in order to bring them to the negotiating table. So.
Ben, thank you so much for this absolutely wonderful presentation. It was exhilarating listening to you. You're an absolutely gifted speaker, a great loss to the UK, even if you're an adornment to your homeland. And I hope you convert the Department of State in the US to greater interest in Afghanistan, particularly given its current problems of starvation, famine, and so forth, and desperate need of international aid. So everyone, this is a fantastic book by a fantastic author with a fantastic mind who's given us a fantastic talk tonight. It's on a special, £27 from Waterstones, so we're very spoilt in the UK, and I think even if you add postage to the United States, you'll still get it cheaper than Amazon over there, and definitely bit cheaper than Harvard University Press. So I hope this price reduction in the UK means it's going into paperback and will be available to an even wider audience. And I expect that will be the case because you've recently won the first of, I'm sure, many book awards for this rather unpronounceable book prize, Ananda Kentish Coomaraswamy Award for making such a distinguished contribution to the study of your particular subject and revising ideas about it. So well done, and thank you so much, and enjoy a rest and a nice glass of water after talking non-stop for 2 hours. Thank you so much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you all for listening.
Bye-bye.